Hitting record. All right, ladies, so we are back for chapter 9 of Hebrews, and there's just two of us participating actively this time, but that's okay. That's part of the reason that we do record for YouTube, so anybody who misses a week can come back and watch and catch back up for the next time. So we're going to start a few verses before chapter 9. We'll look at chapter 8, verse 13, and then we'll go through chapter 9, verse 5. Would you like to read first?
Sure. By saying a new covenant, he has declared that the first is obsolete, and what is obsolete and growing old is about to pass away. Now, the first covenant also had regulations for ministry and an earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle was set up, and in the first room, which is called the holy place, where the lampstand and the table and the presentation lit loaves. Behind the second curtain was a tent called the most holy place. It had the gold altar of incense and the ark of the covenant, covered with gold on all sides, in which was a gold jar containing the manna, Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. The cherubim of glory were above the ark, overshadowing the mercy seat. It is not possible to speak about these things in detail right now. That's 5.
Yep.
Is that it?
Yep. So the last about half of chapter 8 was talking about the new covenant versus the old covenant, and what that means, that there was spoken of going to be a time for a new covenant. And then chapter 9 is really going to start comparing what does that mean that there was an old covenant and the new covenant, and what's the difference? What are some of the differences? So here he's setting up, he starts the end of chapter 8, what's becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. And then he lays out for us what is vanishing, what's going away. I'm seeing my shades back here. The dog's got his head right there. So it's like, why is that sticking out? Okay, sorry. So he's looking at the first covenant, the old covenant, what's ready to pass away. And he's explaining all of these physical things about it that the Hebrews would have been familiar with. They would have known what the tabernacle is set up like and how it's used. And it might feel kind of foreign for them to think about these physical things passing away. They've seen it, or some of them they haven't seen with their eyes because they aren't allowed in that portion of the tabernacle. But they know what these things look like. They've read the writings about what they're supposed to be like. They know, and they also know that they're still there in the tabernacle. So it'd be kind of weird to say, hey, these physical things are now becoming obsolete when they're physically still there. And that's kind of what the author is getting at, is that, there was a time and place for these physical things, and there was a use for them. And under this new covenant, these things are not what they once were. Their purpose has been fulfilled, and it's time to move on to the next covenant. And what does that look like? Did you have any thoughts on this passage, this section?
Nothing further.
Okay. Let's see. So he's laying out all these various pieces of equipment, I guess is a word that you could use, that were used in aspects of worship in the Old Covenant. And then he's going to talk about the very usage of these things is in and of themselves pointing to the inadequacy of the first covenant. And we're going to read about that in the next section. So I'll read verses 6 through 10. It says, "Now when these things had been thus prepared, the priest always went into the first part of the tabernacle, performing the services. But into the second part, the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet manifest, while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was symbolic for the present time, in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience, concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation." So I'll start and let you, if you have any comments or questions first, and then I'll kind of wade through that. So do you have any
Okay.
thoughts? Anything stick out at you?
I think it was just really basically explaining the way it was used and why it was set up the way that it was, that the high priest, I think he's preparing us to understand Jesus's role in the new covenant by actually defining the priest's role in the old covenant. So he's bringing, so that we're learning that he's the only one that could go into the Holy of Holies, and that sin was done in ignorance, that we could do it in ignorance. And that's what I'm thinking, but I don't know. I haven't gone further on.
All your thoughts, that's definitely a lot of what he's talking about here. I was just going to expound on that too and point out that basically the way that these sacrifices were being offered was pointing forward to, all of these, the sacrifices required all of these like precursors. So only the high priest could go into the holiest of, this says holiest of all, or the holy of holies, the most holy place, whatever your translation calls that. Only the high priest could go in there. He could only go in there once a year, and he could only go in there after having made the sacrifice. And so it's showing the limitation to the system in that these sacrifices couldn't just be made whenever. They couldn't just be made, each time it was needed. They could only be made under certain circumstances and certain situations. And it's pointing forward to a time when all of those circumstances are pre-met. Like we don't have to keep certifying the high priest, for lack of a better word. And so let's see. Yeah, it says it was verse 9. It was symbolic for the present time, in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. And so Christ, even if he were to offer these sacrifices, those sacrifices would not make him qualified in the way the high priest was, because he doesn't need to offer for himself the sacrifice, right? And the high priest had to offer that sacrifice to cleanse himself of his own personal sins. Christ didn't need to do that. His conscience was already clean. And so, so that's what this is talking about. I feel like I had another thought there, but if it comes back to me, we'll come back to it. I want to read verse 10 again and then go on through verse 15. Do you want to read that, verse 10 through 15?
Okay. They are physical regulations and only deal with food, drink, and various washings imposed until the time of the new order. But Christ has appeared as a high priest of good things that have come. In the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered the most holy place once and for all times, not by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a young cow sprinkled those who are defiled, sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse our consciousness from dead works so that we can serve the living God. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called might receive the promise of the eternal inheritance, because as a death has taken place for redemption from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. Because as a death has taken place for the redemption from the transgression committed under the first covenant.
Awesome. Yeah. So I wanted to hit on the very end of verse 10 says, so he's talking about all of these physical aspects of the worship, the foods and drinks, the washings, fleshly ordinances, imposed until the time of Reformation. So there was a time that they were intended to stop. And again, thinking about what the Hebrews would have been thinking, they wouldn't have necessarily been thinking about the fact that these things that they did every single year, they did it from their birth, or their families did it from their birth, but it's been generations and generations of these rituals that have not ceased. But they had a time that they were going to cease. There was this time of Reformation to come. And then we have that when Christ comes as the high priest of what my translation says, high priest of the good things to come. And so his sacrifice being better than the sacrifice of an animal, he is a man, he is also God, and those two things in and of themselves make his offering, his death, more weighty than the death of bulls and goats and rams. And so his sacrifice would have been more substantial than the sacrifice of these recurring animal sacrifices. And we've talked before about this phrasing, how much more. So if these sacrifices they made every year with an animal were covering sins, how much more would, excuse my dog, how much more would the sacrifice of this God in the form of man cover our sins once? We wouldn't have to keep killing him. People, we don't die more than once. We only die once. I think where was that? Maybe it's later. There was a verse that talks about him being man, and man only dies once. Man only has to die once. So he came as man, he dies once. His one death covers all of sin. He doesn't have to keep re-dying. He doesn't have to offer sacrifices to cleanse himself before he makes offerings on our behalf. Did you have any thoughts on this section?
No, I think is saying, why Christ is enough to satisfy the new covenant.
For sure. And then let's see. Verse 15, for this reason, he's the mediator of the new covenant by means of death, for the redemption of transgressions under the first covenant. So what it's saying is, he's not only the mediator for this covenant, this better covenant, but his sacrifice is sufficient for those under the first covenant as well. And that's how much better his sacrifice, his offering is, that it stands for all the people moving forward, but it also stands for all the people moving backward. It covers all of them. That's how much better the sacrifice is. So I can imagine that would be a lot to take in. You think about, I mean, it is, you think about, okay, sure, from this time on, that makes sense, but to be able to go back and like retroactively cover all those sins is kind of like, whoa, that's crazy.
Yeah, because that must have been something that they would have thought about or questioned about as well. What about all the people who died before? What
Right.
if this covenant goes away and it wasn't enough? What about all the people who died before Christ came and they could hear Christ and have the opportunity to accept him as the Christ?
Mhm.
So yeah.
Like, what about my grandma? What about my dad? He died, last year. He couldn't meet Christ. What does that mean for him? Or
What about Abraham?
Yeah, exactly. What about Abraham? I thought Moses was, the
Yeah.
thing. What about Moses? Yeah, exactly. So very interesting. I think it would have been hard, kind of double-sided. It'd be hard to really fathom that, but it also would be really comforting to be able to say, it is sufficient for them. It's not it is without limit. It's not like, oh, well, that's too much for this sacrifice, or he has to offer a different sacrifice, or another better. There's no other better sacrifice. This is it. This is all encompassing. This is it.
Yeah.
So yeah. All right. Let's see. I will read. All right, I'll read verses 16 through 22. It says, "For where there is a testament, there must also by necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. Therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, 'This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you.' Then likewise he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no remission." Did you have any thoughts, or do you want me to just
I'll let you go.
Okay, so I'm gonna reread the first couple verses, and I'm gonna use a different word. And we all might know what the word testament means, but I think using a different word is gonna give it a little bit different context for us to understand. So I'm gonna read again. "For where there is a will, there must also be by necessity be the death of the testator," or the I don't know what word we use for that. What?
The one who made the will.
Yeah, the one who made the will. "For a will is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the one who made the will lives." So we see the word testament, and I think we might get a little confused, because for me, I only know really the word testament used Old Testament, New Testament. But what the word testament means is it's the same thing as a will. It's something that there's parameters around it, but certain conditions have to be met. One of the conditions of a will is that I don't know the word. I know there's a word for the person, but whoever wrote the will has to die before the will comes into effect. It's not.
Is it testate? Is that the word you're looking for?
Yeah, there is that is the word here, and I'm wanting to say there's a different word, but I could be wrong.
Gotcha.
I'm not a legal person.
Well, there you go. That's all right. We
But
got it.
until that person dies, the will is just a piece of paper and it can't do anything. It doesn't have any power until the person dies. And so he's saying even the first covenant was not put into place until a death happened. So Moses wrote out all the laws, he wrote out the testament, and it wasn't put into effect until after he spoke it. And then he made a sacrifice and he sprinkled all of the necessary things with the blood of the sacrifice, signifying this is the death that puts into practice this will that has been established. And so, again,
And that it was God ordained is also stressed at the very end of that
yeah,
section. So
yeah, exactly. According to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and with shedding of blood, without shedding of blood, there's no remission. So this is what God commanded to happen, and this was the way it was commanded to happen, with the death of something to put it into effect. And again, it's gonna be brought up later, but Christ's death, he only had to die once. He was the sacrifice to enact the second will. He was the one who wrote the will, so to speak, and his will couldn't come into effect until he died. And he only dies once. Man only dies once. We don't have a repeat Christ. We don't have a repeat Savior. We have one, and his sacrifice is it. That's what puts it into effect. Any questions there?
nope.
All right. Then do you want to read the last section, 23 to 28?
Sure. Therefore, it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves to be purified with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with hands, only a model of the true one, but into heaven itself, so that he might now appear in the presence of God for us. He did not do this to offer himself many times as a high priest enters the sanctuary yearly with the blood of another. Otherwise, he would have had to suffer many times since the foundation of the world. But now he has appeared one time at the end of the ages for the removal of sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for people to die once, and after this judgment, so also Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him.
Right. So yeah, we have the copies of the things in heaven, the worship items in heaven, the way that worship is done in heaven. So these copies required the deaths of these animals to keep them purified. And he's saying if just if just these sacrifices were good enough for the earthly things, it would stand to reason that a heavenly original would need something greater than these animal sacrifices. And so Christ, when he's going in to offer the offerings for man's sins, he has to be offering something better than these animal sacrifices. And as it's been established already in the chapter, as we talked about, and it's been established before, his sacrifice was better than all of those animal sacrifices. It was able to actually cleanse these original heavenly articles of worship or tools or equipment, whatever word you want to use there. And so, yeah, and again, I've hit on it a couple times. I knew it was in the chapter, and I was like, I thought we read it. We didn't read it. But it just talks about he didn't need to die more than once. He didn't need to keep re-dying in order to make the sacrifice. It was once and done, all covered for all of time, because as a man, we don't die more than once. And it does say, the last verse talks about he is coming back. He's going to show up again, but it's not for the sake of reoffering this sacrifice, this cleansing sacrifice. It's as a hope for those of us here to know that we're saved. It's something for us to look forward to, that he's going to come back, and his revelation again isn't about offering for our sins. It's about, you've been saved. This is it. Your salvation is here in front of you. It's been realized. And you can know when you see Christ that you're saved. That's, time is over. We're done. Judgment's ready. And it's not another sacrifice. It's not like you have to wait and be cleansed again. It's just, it's salvation.
Also, on this section, what I noticed is that it's another where he's giving them a way to realize that Christ is a high priest, because where the priest went into the Holy of Holies to be in the presence of God to offer atonement for sins, he says Christ has entered into heaven, which the Holy of Holies on earth represents what's in heaven. So Christ is the only one that entered into there, and the high priest is the only one that could enter into the Holy of Holies. So this gives the Hebrews another opportunity to see Christ's role and the fact that he truly is the high priest of God.
Yeah, and capitalizing on that too is the betterness of this covenant. I think it was, we talked about it last time, so it's somewhere in 7 or 8 where it talks about Christ is literally at the right hand of God. And so the high priest, when they went into the Holy of Holies, they were in the presence of God, in that God was sitting there on the mercy seat, but he wasn't physically with them in the way that Christ is physically with God in heaven. That's another betterment. It's rolling forward that concept, like you're saying, of the high priest went into this part by themselves, only them, and they were with God. And Christ does the same thing, but he is literally actually with God. So for sure, very, very important. It would have meant, I'm sure it would have meant a lot to the Hebrews to really think about that. Like, this is what they did every year, and he's doing it on my behalf all the time, and it's better. I just think it would be hard to wrap your head around better, because you would grow up with this concept. You would grow up knowing what this worship was like and how, important it was to keep all of the rules and keep all the regulations and to follow through with it the way that it was laid out. And to think that it was even possible that there was something better than that. I think it would be hard for me to really accept that and wrap my head around it if I were in their shoes. And I guess really for us today, that can be hard. If if you have ideas about who Christ is or what worship is supposed to be like, if you grow up thinking worship is one way, and then coming to the Bible, coming to the scriptures and reading maybe something different than what you grew up thinking, it makes sense that it would be hard to leave that or to adjust that, because how do we know there's something better when this seems like what it's been? You know what I mean? Like this is what I know. This is how I understand Christ, or how I understand spirituality, and coming to grips with that might be a challenge for us today even.
Yeah, truly.
For sure. Okay, well, next time we'll go through chapter 10. Like I said, chapter 10 is also kind of long, so we won't be able to do 2 chapters next time.
Okay.
It looks
All right.
like all the rest of the chapters are long, so we'll just do 1 chapter each time.
Okay.
I think that will be 2 weeks from yesterday, but we'll talk about that and make sure we get that date solidified for everybody for next time. But
All right.
thanks.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Well,
We'll talk
thank
soon.
you. Good night. Sleep
Good
tight.
night. Bye.
Bye.